I am here to represent the formalists. So, new formalism is a term from poetry. I like poetry. I reference it in talks like these. I write it sometimes. I have a poetry sheepskin, which is way less useful than a game criticism sheepskin, I assure you. Poetry's nice, and poetry is kind of irrelevant because nobody, including most poets, reads poetry unless they're forced to. These are books off my poetry shelf that I accumulated over the years. This particular set happens to be experiential, confessional. Back when I was in college, we railed against what we nicknamed me poetry. It was a confessional time in the culture, you see, and for that matter, I think every poet who's just coming out of high school is probably writing confessional poetry. It's kind of a law of nature. It's also sort of a law of nature that if you're a student, you have to rebel against whatever the prevailing wind is. That's part of your role, is to rebel against the orthodoxy, and that was the orthodoxy of the time. New formalism in poetry was actually a rebellion, an old rebellion by the time I came along. This was 20 plus years ago, by the way. Poetry motions happen in very slow motion, right? Poetry movements. This was people like Dana Gioia and Dick Allen and W.D. Snodgrass who were rebelling against language poetry and concrete poetry and the Beats and John Cage and John Ashbery and even Walt Whitman. So we're talking a 50-year-old rebellion against a 100-year-old trend, and the way that they did their rebellion was by reaching back even further to formal verse techniques that were like 500 years old. Now we can think of that as being conservatism, I suppose. I mean, Gioia kicked off this as a movement with this paper here, complaining not just about confessionalism, but about the language not being musical, which is really missing the point of concrete poetry, to talk about its lack of musicality instead of celebrating its physicality, right? But the picture isn't that simple. For one thing, concrete poetry, George Herbert showed us that you could have physicality and musicality coexisting just fine hundreds of years ago. This is a false axis, right? For another, we keep saying that harking back to the past might be, radical. It's similar to how new realism is upending realism, how contemporary realism is blowing up notions of photography. That's a pencil drawing, right? Not a photo. So, a lot of art games and indie games feel to me analogous to, for example, language or concrete poetry, or to confessionalism, right? And it seems to me that we could probably link a curmudgeonly statement like, this is not a game, to a curmudgeonly statement like, that isn't very musical. But there is another lens. New formalism was actually a populist movement. It was trying to reclaim an audience for poetry that had been lost by going back to the strengths that poetry used to have. A lot like how casual games are populist in very large part because they don't go for the heavy narrative, the presentation elements, and all of the elements of gamer culture. In that sense, new formalism wasn't actually hugely out of tune with the culture as a whole. It suffered from being a movement of older white men that missed the boat, when in fact, formal poetry actually did come back in a massive singer-songwriter resurgence in the 1980s, in slam poetry and performance poetry, and in early hip-hop, all of which had way more in common with new formalism than they did with the canon or the avant-garde of poetry at the time. Why am I telling you about poetry? First of all, because formalism is a label imposed from outside the supposed formalists, okay? There aren't any game formalists who called themselves game formalists. In music, it's applied to people like him, okay? Which raises two key points I think we can't forget. First, usually it's the avant-garde that gets called formalist. In other words, problem addict, depression quest, dysphoria is what would be called formalist in most other media. So it's really weird that we use the terms in reverse in games. The second thing is that formal terms are always bounded, always happen inside a really deep context, of practice and culture. What's formal to one person is deeply informal to another. And the use of a word inside of, let's say, Stalinist Russia, in order to get this guy to stop writing music that wasn't romantic and patriotic for Stalin, has very deeply different implications when it's heard, not even used, just heard outside of that circle by somebody in another field, time, or place. So if we leave the poetry aside for just a second and use music as an analogy, these are all ways of looking at music and doing music criticism. You're presumably familiar with all of these. This here is All Along the Watchtower. Above we have the Dylan original, below the Hendrix version. And we can see here, not only is the key different, but Hendrix actually changed the harmony of the song. He changed the passing note into a new chord. That's a radical change to this song from a harmonic point of view. But is All Along the Watchtower a different song? No. A melodic analysis tells us actually they both follow the same melody. It's still All Along the Watchtower. Then you move over to, say, Michael Hedges' cover. How many of you have heard that, by the way? It's awesome. You totally should hear it. The rhythm of it is completely different, even though the melody and the harmonies are similar. And a producer might be more interested in a spectrogram analysis. This is the Hendrix version. He might be looking for whether the transients are punchy enough. And we haven't even gotten to the kind of thing that most game critics do, right? We haven't even gotten to Simon Cowell calling somebody a donkey because they're butchering the song on American Idol. We haven't gotten to a review in Pitchfork, or the stuff that I think most game criticism is currently oriented around, which is criticism that connects back out to the larger culture. Talking, for example, about the way in which the Indigo Girls in their cover of All Along the Watchtower reclaimed the song from alienation by adding a break, "Take my hand, you are a part of the world," which fundamentally changed the meaning of the song. Game grammar, formalism, rules, play, all the stuff that's associated with all these heads up here, pretty much all fits down at the bottom end of this scale that I showed you. The most mechanical pieces and the pieces that are actually the hardest to see. Mechanical bits tend to be invariant across huge swaths of games. By this lens, most of Saints Row 4 is the same game as GTA 4. There have only been 5 fighting games in all of gaming history, and Gone Home is a game about turning over cards in a fairly fixed order to read what is on the other side. What most criticism calls a genre, this kind of analysis says all the same game, or variants, the way that Texas Hold'em is a poker variant. But that's okay, because as everybody from Woody Guthrie on has said, you only need 3 chords and the truth to get a message across. Many great pieces of music have been written with a 1-4-5, and knowing that something is a blues creates a whole new dimension of criticism for it, fits it into a cultural framework. The first place I think this is really useful is any form of historiography. You can't trace the development of jazz without following the flatted fifth in its journey from African scales to bent notes, and then to reclaiming the tritone, the devil's interval, from Western classical music. It's a cultural, political, and technical journey, and you can't understand it outside of that intersection. Another place where formal style bright lines help is in creating negative space. On this sheet music, we have dynamics notated, performance annotations. This is Ravel's Bolero, okay? Everything in this piece is about analyzing dynamics, because it's the same melody and harmony repeated 10 times. There's huge scope in dynamics. Using a formalist lens that looks at harmony and melody as distinct from performance and timbre, you can actually peel away the piano versus the orchestral versus the art rock versions and see what the differences are more clearly. The biggest place where formalism does that, I think, is in examining the rhetorics of games. This is actually a fairly formalist take on that, but I think we could actually be leveraging a lot of traditional rhetorics. That's actually even a humanities formalism that maybe we're too steeped in to even notice is being used through games. Beyond that, we could even see how these systems function in those rhetorical roles in our everyday lives. This is language that already exists and could be leveraged, the formalism of another discipline. The other big lens I think formalism has the potential to illuminate is the notion of play. We still play music. Lately, games formalism is starting to say that there are ludic structures everywhere, chord progressions and a beat that you can dance to anywhere in life. That means we should be able to apply the critical language of game studies, such as it is, to elements well outside of the label of games. We could be applying them to elections, to Wall Street, to all of the vast systems in the world, looking at them as ludic structures, games we play with one another, games we play without consent, games that we are tokens in. And we could go beyond the shallow and facile observation and actually offer real critique of those systems in a way that opens up social change. In the end, it takes a formal lens to really discuss the idea that Twine is also avant-garde literature and that the social issues affecting the 99% also manifest in World of Warcraft guilds. This critique could not happen without a deep understanding of formal game elements. The debates about what is a game happened in multiple overlapping circles that have very little to do with one another. Forums on NeoGAF, the question of who sits on award panels, what is taught in universities, whether feedback is narrative, whether all kinds of people are able, allowed, permitted to make games in the culture as it now sits. That debate is different depending on where you're standing. Games is never going to fall into one bucket, one critical lens. But we can build bridges and connections between buckets using these kinds of analyses. And in the end, that is a more intersectional approach because it recognizes identity and commonalities at the same time. We enrich ourselves and our mutual understanding not by claiming preeminence of a circle, but by learning to move between them. Thank you.